They said you could hear it before you ever saw it. A long, hollow wail rising from the valley, like a house remembering every scream it ever swallowed. For a century, no one stayed beyond a single night. Families vanished. Soldiers deserted. Even priests refused to bless it. Locals called it the house that screamed, a place so cursed that its windows seemed to weep when the wind passed through. But behind its rotting walls lies a history far darker than any ghost story. A truth buried under blood, madness, and a crime that time itself tried to forget. In 1821, the Bellamy family arrived in Harrow County, Virginia, an isolated patch of land carved between two forested ridges, where the soil was dark as coal and the fog rolled low across the ground like something alive. Colonel Alaric Bellamy, the family's patriarch, was a man both admired and feared. He had served with distinction in the War of 1812, a decorated officer known for his rigid discipline and uncanny luck on the battlefield. When he returned home, he was not the same man he'd been. Neighbors described him as withdrawn, easily startled, and prone to speaking softly to himself in a tone that suggested he was addressing someone unseen. Bellamy purchased the land at the edge of the valley for almost nothing. The locals knew it was cursed ground. Long before the war, the native Monacan tribe had refused to build near it, claiming the earth there wept blood. Settlers who attempted to till it found their animals restless, their children plagued with nightmares, and their wells filled with an oily, metallic-tasting water. Still, Bellamy pressed forward. He hired 20 men to clear the trees and begin construction on what would become Bellamy Manor, a sprawling, two-story plantation house with a sweeping veranda, high gabled roof, and 6 bedrooms lined with ornate walnut paneling imported from Charleston. It was meant to be a monument to his triumph and resilience, a place where he and his family could begin anew. Eleanor Bellamy, his wife, was known throughout Richmond society for her delicate manners and charitable spirit. But those who saw her after the move said she looked pale and haunted, her once bright eyes dulled as if she were always listening for something. The colonel's 2 children, Henry, aged 9, and Clara, only 6, were often seen wandering the fields alone, though the servant said the children played strange games involving the Whispering Man, a name they gave to someone who wasn't there. The house's completion was celebrated with a grand feast that autumn. Guests from neighboring counties arrived in carriages to drink, dance, and tour the colonel's new estate. That night, according to surviving accounts, the air felt unusually heavy. The wind stilled, the lamps flickered, and several guests remarked that the walls seemed to hum, an almost imperceptible vibration, like distant thunder buried deep within the earth. The colonel dismissed it as the settling of wood. By winter, the servants began to quit one by one. They claimed to hear knocking from the walls and muffled crying from the cellar. One maid swore she saw a figure standing in the nursery, a man in uniform, half his face missing, staring at the children as they slept. When she screamed, the colonel forbade anyone to speak of it again. Within days, she was gone, leaving behind her wages and belongings. Eleanor wrote a series of letters to her sister in Richmond, describing her growing dread. "Alaric is not himself," she wrote. "He spends long hours in the study speaking to shadows. The children wake screaming each night, and sometimes I could swear I hear voices, calling from beneath the floor. Those letters would never be mailed. The final entry in the estate's record is dated February 7, 1822. It notes that a snowstorm struck the region that evening and that the house was sealed against the cold. No one in the valley saw the Bellamys again. When the sheriff came to investigate weeks later, he found the doors bolted from within and every window shutter nailed tight. Inside, the fireplaces were cold, the beds made, the dinner table still set for 4. Not a trace of the family remained, only the faint smell of burned oil and, faintly, a sound that seemed to echo from the walls. Something like a breath, something like a scream. In the years that followed the Bellamy's disappearance, the house stood in silence, its shutters rattling in the wind, its white paint slowly graying beneath the heavy Virginia rain. Locals avoided the hill where it stood, saying the air there felt too still, too heavy. But on cold nights, travelers swore they could hear cries drifting from the manor, echoing faintly down the valley. The first reports came from a farmer named Amos Reed, who claimed that while tending his livestock before dawn, he heard a woman's voice crying, "Please God, let us out." He followed the sound toward the house until it became so loud it seemed to come from all directions at once. He never went near the property again. Within months, word spread through the county that something unholy lingered inside those walls. When the sheriff finally gathered a small group of men to inspect it, what they found unsettled even the most hardened among them. There were deep scratches gouged into the interior doors as though made by fingernails. The wallpaper in the children's room had been torn away, revealing faint handprints pressed into the plaster. And though every window was sealed shut, a constant whispering draft moved through the house, carrying with it a sound that resembled weeping. The townspeople called it the Bellamy curse. But beneath the superstition, a darker truth hid in plain sight. Historians who later examined records from that winter uncovered signs that a deadly outbreak of yellow fever had reached the region. Many families had fallen ill, their bodies buried in shallow, unmarked graves. It is believed that Colonel Bellamy, terrified of contagion, locked his household inside, ordering the servants to bar the doors and seal the windows with iron nails. What began as an act of protection quickly turned into a prison. By the time the fever passed, the house was silent. The colonel's servants, those who had escaped before the lockdown, told stories of hearing screams for days after the doors were shut. They spoke of Eleanor's voice pleading through the wood, the children's cries fading night after night, until the only sound that remained was a rhythmic pounding, as though someone inside was striking the wall to signal for help. When the noise finally stopped, no one dared open the doors. A century later, the coroner's notes from 1822 were rediscovered. In them, a short passage mentioned that the sheriff who investigated the property refused to step beyond the threshold, saying the air inside moved like it was breathing. The manor's walls had absorbed a century of moisture and decay, but perhaps something else too, something less tangible. The timbers themselves had been cut from swamp oak, known to trap and release sound. When the wind passed through the structure, it carried echoes that mimicked human cries. Yet even this explanation failed to account for what visitors described. Not a single scream, but many, layered voices rising and falling like a chorus. In later years, curious travelers tried to spend the night in the house. None stayed longer than a few hours. One diary entry, found in 1847 by a local boy scavenging for wood, belonged to a drifter named Simon Hale. His handwriting trembled across the page. The screams are inside the walls. They start low like someone humming and then build until the sound shakes the glass. It's not the wind. It's them. I feel them moving in the floorboards. The entry ended abruptly, ink smeared, as if his hand had been yanked away mid-sentence. He was never seen again. The townspeople sealed the house once more, nailing the doors shut and surrounding it with iron fencing. But every February, on the anniversary of that winter night, the valley still carried that sound. Travelers described it as the wailing of a woman, though others said it was many voices. Men, women, children, screaming not in terror, but in grief. The house had become a monument to its own crime, retelling the same story year after year through its wooden lungs. And so what began as a tragedy of fear and confinement turned into the first night of endless screams, the beginning of a century-long legend that no one could explain or silence. Over the decades that followed, people continued to test the legend of the Bellamy House, driven by curiosity, greed, or disbelief. The first to return was a traveling trader named Emmett Crow in 1843. He was a drifter who claimed not to fear old wives' tales. For 2 nights he camped inside the front parlor, sleeping beside the cold hearth with a pistol under his coat. On the 3rd morning, a passing farmer found his horse still tethered outside, the saddle soaked with dew, but Crow was gone. Inside, the chairs were overturned, and on the wall above the mantel, someone had carved a single word: listen. In 1863, amid the chaos of the Civil War, a Confederate deserter named Corporal James Rutledge sought refuge in the house. His tattered journal, later recovered from the ashes of the fireplace, gave one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of what it was like inside. The entries began calm, notes about rationing, about avoiding Union patrols. But as the days passed, his handwriting grew frantic. The walls whisper my name, he wrote on the 3rd night. They know what I've done. By the 5th, he spoke of voices repeating his thoughts before he could say them. If I think of leaving, one entry read, the whisper grows angry. The final page contained only 4 words, written in a shaking hand, it knows my name. Rutledge's body was never found. though the floorboards near the study bore dark stains that no one could scrub away. Decades later, in 1899, a Catholic priest from Maryland named Father Andrew Malloy arrived after hearing the local legends. He believed the manor was a site of spiritual unrest, a purgatory for souls unable to cross. Armed with holy water, a Bible, and 2 young acolytes, he entered at dusk to perform an exorcism. Only one of the boys emerged alive, staggering down the road at dawn, half blind and raving. His testimony, recorded weeks later before his death from fever, described how the house had come alive during the ritual, the floors trembling, the walls weeping as a terrible wind rose from within the chimney. He said Father Malloy began to pray louder, but his voice was drowned out by something else, something that screamed through every beam and floorboard. When the townsfolk entered days later, they found Malloy's Bible split open, its pages swollen and warped as though soaked in tears. The 20th century brought skeptics and scholars. In 1912, a doctor named Harold Pennington, a lecturer in early psychology and acoustic science, announced that he would spend 7 nights inside the Bellamy house to prove the phenomenon was merely sound distortion. He arrived with an assistant, a gramophone, and wax recording cylinders. Each day he sent notes to the post office describing his findings. For 5 days the notes were mundane, measurements of wind currents, humidity levels, and timber resonance. On the 6th day, the postmaster received only a shattered wax cylinder with 1 fragment of audio. A man's trembling voice whispering, "There's someone in the wall." Pennington's assistant vanished, and the experiment was never repeated. Through the 1930s and 40s, the property was fenced off, though rumors persisted that strange lights flickered from its windows during storms. Children dared each other to run to the porch and touch the door, but most would freeze halfway, claiming to hear muffled sobs inside. A county clerk once attempted to have the structure demolished, yet each hired crew quit after the first inspection. One foreman told a local paper, "You can feel it looking at you." The house, it's not empty. In every era, the stories remained the same. The whispers, the voices, the unseen presence that seemed to echo a suffering long past. Some said the Bellamys were cursed, others that the land itself was haunted by those buried beneath it. But the most disturbing accounts came not from the locals, but from those who entered believing they could explain it, and came out forever changed, insisting that what they'd heard inside was not a haunting at all, but a memory that refused to die. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, the Bellamy house had drawn the attention of historians, police investigators, and thrill-seekers alike. Its reputation as the house that screamed had grown beyond Harrow County, passed down through whispers and newspaper clippings that described it as America's most cursed home. Yet behind the folklore lay a grim record of deaths, each one connected to someone who dared to uncover its truth. In 1927, the county registry officially condemned the property, but not before one last inspection was ordered by Sheriff William Greeley. He was a practical man, a veteran of the Great War, unshaken by ghost stories or local superstition. In his report, he described the house as structurally unstable yet oddly intact for its age. He and his deputy entered around noon. By sunset, only Greeley returned. His deputy, Thomas Kane, was found 3 days later in the surrounding woods. His body twisted in the mud, his face frozen in what the coroner called a posture of mortal terror. Greeley refused to speak of what happened inside, but when questioned, he simply said, "The walls were breathing." He resigned a month later and left town without a word. In the 1940s, a journalist from Richmond, Margaret Vale, arrived to write an article for Southern Mysteries Quarterly. Her notes, found years later in a locked trunk at her boarding house, reveal a meticulous investigation into the Bellamy family's disappearance. She had uncovered court records showing that before his death, Colonel Bellamy had taken out a private loan from a shipping magnate, offering not just his property but certain living assets as collateral. The phrasing was chillingly vague. Vale believed the colonel might have been involved in the transport or trade of human beings after the legal abolition of slavery, an illegal market that thrived quietly in Virginia's backroads. Her final entry read, "I've found something under the floor of the study. Small bones, human but not adult. Someone tried to hide them. The house hums louder when I'm near that spot." After that line, the journal ended abruptly. Margaret Vale vanished without trace. Her car was discovered idling near the old road, its headlights still on. A renewed investigation in 1954 brought a team of university researchers, armed with modern equipment. They approached the case scientifically, photographing every room, measuring temperature fluctuations and recording sounds through the night. On the fourth evening, lightning struck the oak tree beside the manor, shattering it and exposing a small, sealed stone cellar beneath its roots. Inside, they found what the town had long feared: skeletal remains of at least 5 individuals. One was believed to be an adult female, another a child, both still clutching each other in what looked like a final embrace. The others bore signs of suffocation, their hands outstretched toward a sealed wooden hatch. On the stone wall above them, carved deep into the rock, were the words, "We are still here." The discovery was reported briefly in the local paper but quickly suppressed. Authorities cited desecration of private property as the reason the details were withheld. Yet rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed that the screams had grown louder after the cellar was opened. Residents living miles away said the sound echoed across the valley that night. Long, drawn-out wails followed by silence that lasted for hours. In 1961, an audio engineer named Charles Hadley tried to record the phenomenon. He set up microphones along the property line and left them running overnight. The next morning, his equipment was found melted and warped, the tape reels fused together. But one short segment survived. It captured what sounded like a woman whispering through static. The door was never opened. The sheriff's office dismissed it as tampering, but locals knew better. Every investigation, scientific, historical, or criminal, ended the same way: in tragedy, disappearance, or madness. No one who tried to explain the Bellamy house walked away unchanged. For each answer uncovered, 2 new horrors seemed to emerge, as if the place itself resisted being understood. The evidence, the testimonies, the bones in the ground, all pointed to something that began as a human crime, but had become something far worse, something the living could no longer separate from myth. Over time, as the legend of the Bellamy house deepened, scholars and skeptics attempted to interpret its strange legacy through science, folklore, and psychology. For generations, the townspeople insisted the house was cursed, haunted by the trapped souls of the Bellamy family. But when modern investigators began revisiting the case, a new line of thought emerged, one that sought to explain the screaming house not through spirits, but through the psychology of fear and memory itself. One of the earliest psychological analyses came from Dr. Lawrence Kent in 1968, a historian of paranormal folklore. He argued that the phenomenon surrounding the Bellamy house might not be supernatural at all, but a product of psychic imprinting, the idea that traumatic energy, like a recording, can be imprinted into the environment and replayed under certain conditions. He compared the house to a broken phonograph, replaying the final moments of the Bellamy family over and over again. When interviewed years later, Kent admitted he could not prove his theory scientifically, but the emotional weight of the place had convinced him. Some tragedies, he said, don't end when the bodies are gone. They continue in the air, in the timbers, in the minds of those who listen. Architectural experts had their own explanations. In the 1970s, structural engineers studied the building's strange acoustics. The manor had been constructed from swamp oak and pine, woods known to warp under moisture, bending and groaning with subtle shifts in temperature. Combined with the valley's unique topography, the house could amplify natural sounds in unsettling ways. Wind blowing through the hollowed chimneys and gaps in the boards could produce tones that mimicked human voices. It was, as one engineer described, a perfect instrument for fear. Yet even after this study, visitors who stepped inside swore the sound was not mere wind. The screams carried emotion, sorrow, rage, despair, things no shifting timber should convey. Local folklore continued to thrive despite every rational theory. Some said the house was built over a burial mound, the resting place of those who died from illness before the town was founded. Others claimed the colonel had performed forbidden rituals during the war, invoking something beyond human comprehension. The Monacan tribe's oral traditions even spoke of the land that remembers, a cursed patch of soil that recorded every violent act committed upon it. In each telling, the house became less a building and more a living vessel, a mouth that could not stop repeating the pain of those who suffered within it. As the decades passed, The Bellamy House became a case study in mass hysteria. Anthropologists noted that the legends surrounding it mirrored post-war anxieties and generational trauma. After the Civil War, and later after World War II, residents projected their own unspoken grief and guilt onto the haunted home. The screams symbolized everything they couldn't name: the losses, betrayals, and sins that lingered just beneath polite Southern society. "It's not the house that screams," one sociologist wrote in 1982. "It's the people listening to it." Despite these theories, no explanation ever silenced the legend. Paranormal researchers pointed out that the reports were too consistent over too many generations. The same patterns, the same cries, the same feeling of suffocation appeared across centuries and witnesses. Some began to suspect that the truth lay somewhere in between science and the supernatural, that both the physical and the psychological could coexist in one place, feeding off one another. The Bellamy House, they said, might not be haunted by ghosts, but by the memory of human cruelty itself, a structure soaked in guilt so profound that even after 100 years, it continued to speak. Scientists could map the airflow and measure vibrations, but they could not explain why the cries sometimes formed words, why so many visitors independently reported hearing a woman whisper, "Let us out," or why, even on calm nights, the air inside the house seemed to tremble as if remembering its own terror. No amount of logic, engineering, or psychology could erase the weight of that sound. The house seemed to exist between worlds, half architecture, half confession, forever retelling a story that the living refused to hear. In 2001, the legend of the Bellamy House was dragged back into public fascination when a small television crew from a regional paranormal show called Spectre Files, America's Haunted South, decided to film an episode there. The show's producers had been drawn to the story after finding Margaret Vale's missing journal pages in a private collection. The team arrived on a cold November evening, 5 people in total: host Daniel Avery, camerawoman Lila Rhodes, audio technician Kyle Brandt, historian Dr. Miriam Cross, and a local guide named Everett Price. They carried digital cameras, EMF meters, and a handful of flashlights. According to their itinerary, they planned to spend one full night inside the house recording everything that happened. Only fragments of that footage were ever released. The surviving clips, preserved later by the sheriff's department, show the team entering just before sunset. Daniel Avery is smiling nervously, narrating into the camera as the group pushes open the heavy front door. The air inside looks dense with dust, every beam of light filled with floating particles. Lila, the camerawoman, whispers that the temperature dropped suddenly as soon as they crossed the threshold. In one brief frame, the audio recorder registers a faint hum, low and steady, like the deep vibration of a distant cello. The group splits into 2 teams, one exploring the upstairs bedrooms, the other moving toward the study. Their microphones pick up irregular bursts of static. When Kyle reviews the playback, a sound can be heard beneath the interference, a voice muttering, though the words are indistinct. They assume it's feedback from the recorder, until Lila points out that none of them were speaking at the time. From there, things unravel quickly. Miriam Cross's handwritten notes, later found inside her backpack near the entrance, describe what happened next. "The walls are moving," she wrote. "It feels like breath on my neck, but no one's behind me. The house creaks as if stretching, like lungs expanding." She noted that the floorboards in the study seemed to vibrate faintly with rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Around midnight, she and Avery reported hearing what sounded like a child crying from inside the fireplace. They tried to locate the source, removing bricks until the opening widened. The crying grew louder, then stopped. The footage ends abruptly after that. What happens between midnight and dawn remains a mystery. At 4:27 a.m., neighbors across the valley saw flashes of light from the house and heard a single drawn-out wail echoing through the fog. When authorities arrived hours later, they found the front door wide open, the equipment smashed, and the interior walls scorched in uneven branching patterns, like veins of lightning frozen into the wood. All 5 members of the crew were gone. Weeks later, the sheriff's office received an unmarked package containing a single mini DV tape. It contained 6 minutes of silent footage, grainy and dark. The camera appears to be lying on its side, pointing toward the grand staircase. In the corner of the frame, a faint silhouette can be seen, perhaps a woman in period clothing, standing motionless as something unseen moves behind her. When the image flickers, the woman's mouth opens as if screaming, but no sound comes out. The tape ends with a brief flash of static and a single whispered phrase barely audible over the hiss. "We're still here." The story broke in local papers, spreading through online forums and eventually becoming one of the internet's earliest viral mysteries. Many dismissed it as a hoax, a fabricated tragedy designed to promote the television series. But others, especially those who'd lived near Harrow County all their lives, recognized the timing. The night the crew disappeared coincided with the anniversary of the Bellamy's sealing in 1822. For the locals, that was no coincidence. In the months that followed, the state officially declared the property off limits. Chain-link fences were erected and warning signs lined the dirt road. Yet even with all access restricted, travelers still claimed to hear it on winter nights. The same hollow wail rising from the valley, like wood bending under impossible pressure. The rational explanations had long since dried up. All that remained were the echoes, the unending cycle of sound and silence that returned again and again, to remind anyone who listened that the house had never truly gone quiet. When the story of the Bellamy house resurfaced in the early 2000s, modern forensic analysis brought forward the most unsettling revelation of all, that the screams haunting the valley were not supernatural, but man-made. After the disappearance of the Spectre Files crew, the state finally authorized a controlled investigation led by forensic anthropologist Dr. Samuel Crane and a small team of crime historians. Their goal was to debunk the myth once and for all. For the first time in over a century, the house was carefully dismantled piece by piece. What they found beneath its foundations changed everything the town thought it knew about the legend. Beneath the cellar, workers uncovered a secondary chamber, hidden behind a layer of brick and sealed with pitch. Inside were the remains of an old mechanical system. Rusted pipes, hollow conduits, and fragments of bellows connected to a set of thin, corroded copper tubes that extended upward into the walls of the house. The pipes led directly into the sitting room, the children's bedroom, and the dining area. Embedded within several of the walls were metal grates, positioned just behind the plaster where sound could travel through. It wasn't a heating or water system, it was acoustic. Someone had built a network designed to carry. Dr. Crane's team concluded that the strange moaning and screaming that generations had described could have been amplified through this hidden mechanism. But the question remained, why would anyone build such a thing? Their answer came when they examined the deeper layer of the structure, where traces of old wiring and a small iron crank were found, connected to a now collapsed shaft that once led to the study floor. The team hypothesized that Colonel Bellamy, or someone working for him, had constructed a crude ventilation system meant to pump air through the sealed house during the 1821 quarantine. When the mechanism failed, the trapped family likely attempted to use it to cry for help, their voices echoing through the pipes and vents. As the air moved through, it distorted and carried their dying screams throughout the building and valley. Even after their deaths, the pipes and hollow floors may have continued to create eerie tones whenever wind passed through, an architectural echo chamber of human suffering. The screaming house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the engineering of its own tragedy. But Crane's investigation didn't end there. He discovered that several of the bones recovered decades earlier had fractures consistent not with suffocation but blunt trauma. There were signs that at least one adult, likely the colonel himself, had been alive longer than the rest, possibly using the cries of his dying family to signal help. When no one came, it appeared he sealed the vents permanently and succumbed to the fumes inside. The theory was horrific. The screams heard across the valley for nights were real. But what people heard afterward, years, even decades later, was merely the resonance of those final moments, replayed through the decaying system that had once been their only means of salvation. The report was never published in full. Dr. Crane died in a car accident months after the investigation ended, and the state quietly buried the findings in an archival vault, citing historical sensitivity. Still, fragments of the case leaked through local journalists and amateur researchers. Many refused to believe it was all mechanical. They claimed that once the pipes were uncovered, the valley grew louder than ever, as if disturbing the system had awakened something that had finally learned to mimic its own sound. Today, only a stone foundation remains where the Bellamy house once stood. The wind still carries the same hollow wail that drew travelers and investigators for centuries. Some say it's just air whistling through what's left of the rusted copper tubes. Others claim it's something else, something that began as a human cry but evolved into a memory too deep for silence to erase. The final truth of the Bellamy House is neither spiritual nor scientific. It is human, a monument to fear, guilt, and the kind of suffering that refuses to fade, echoing endlessly across the years, like a house that learned how to remember pain. If walls could remember, what would yours say? The Bellamy House may be gone, but its echoes still whisper through time. Proof that some screams never stop. They just find new walls to live in. As you think about that, ask yourself, was this house merely haunted by tragedy? Or by the people who refused to listen? If this story unsettled you, if it made you wonder what other forgotten places might still be remembering, then stay with us. Every week we uncover the shadows history tried to bury, the truths that still breathe beneath rotting floorboards and unmarked graves. Subscribe now, and turn on the bell, so you'll be there when we open the next door that should have stayed closed. And before you leave, tell us what you believe. Was the Bellamy House screaming for help, or was it warning us not to come closer? Your thoughts might just lead us to the next forgotten mystery.